Unfortunately, it's not always easy to determine what the trout are feeding on simply by observing insects that's in the air or even on the surface of the water, because they may be feeding on insects that's below the surface of the water. Mayfly nymphs or caddisfly larvae, for example. Underwater selectivity is probably the most overlooked aspect of trout fishing. Trout can feed exclusively on one species of insect, mayfly nymph or caddisfly larva. So don't just assume because you're not catching any fish that you haven't matched the hatch correctly. You may have matched the hatch correctly, but that's not what the trout are feeding on. Don't get too frustrated.
Remember this one very important thing. The main reason you need to know the species of insects the trout are feeding on and the stage of life that they're in at the time is not so much to be able to match the natural with a perfect imitation. It is necessary in order that you know how to fish. Often you can get by with a fly that just gets close to matching the natural. Not always, but often. But you'll never get results fishing something the trout are not eating at the time, or in places where there aren't any feeding trout. But the only thing that you can say positive about a fish is that if there's not any there, you're not going to catch one. That's a fact. Should you be fishing a nymph or larva imitation instead of a dry fly? Should the nymph or larva be presented dead drift near the bottom to imitate naturals that are drifting with the current or with action? Are nymphs crawling along the bottom to the shore to hatch, or are they swimming? Should you be trying to imitate nymphs or pupae that are emerging? Maybe you should be imitating adults that have just emerged and are departing the water seconds later. Should you be imitating flies that are laying eggs by touching the water in flight? Are the flies you see diving to the bottom to lay their eggs? Would you be better off imitating flies that have fallen spent on the surface? Are you fishing where insects are emerging or laying eggs? If there's no action occurring where you're fishing, is something going on somewhere else in slower moving water? Calm water? Faster water of the riffles? Fast water in the runs or pocket water? Are the insects that are hatching, or more importantly, about to hatch, mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, or should you be trying to match emerging midges? If none of this activity is happening, and that's often the case, when will something happen? Would you be wise to stay until dark or head to the nearest bar and try again tomorrow? If you don't know what the trout are feeding on, or worse, know if they're feeding or not, you really just don't know what you're doing. Even if you are aware that trout are feeding on a certain type of insect, but don't know what stage of activity is occurring at the time, you're still relying on pure luck. Fortunately for some of us, it's sometimes good luck, and we'll still manage to catch a few without knowing anything much other than the name of the stream we're fishing. Hatch charts will give you a good idea of what may be happening on any given stream on any date. Careful observations made checking the water, air, and banks will give you a better idea of what's happening. Knowing how to recognize and identify the various species of aquatic and terrestrial insects and other trout foods in its various stages of life will give you a good idea of what's happening. Knowing how to imitate the activity of that food source that the trout are keying in on will give you rewarding results. Matching the food source with a perfect imitation or fly, well, that may be necessary in some cases where the trout are feeding selectively, but it's usually not. The optional series of programs on imitating aquatic insects and other trout food, along with the optional digital hatch guides, provide the information you'll need to know in order to do what we just covered. The digital hatch guides sometimes recommend specific flies you can obtain from fly shops and other commercial sources, and our optional Perfect Fly series will show those that prefer how to tie the specific patterns for each of the insects and other trout food in the series.